will have got to get a little more guts. Yeah.
They need to be putting those screaming headlines that you were talking about earlier. They need to be out there. So what would you say to our young people in the audience, Susanna?
Yeah, so I guess I want to come back to the prophets and why they're so important. The prophetic message of justice and the verse from Amos, the prophet Amos, let justice roll down like water and righteousness as a mighty stream. Justice is the goal. Without justice, there is no peace. And what the prophets give to us is also an important lesson that the opposite of good, my father said, the opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference. So the prophets are so profoundly engaged and concerned, and they are outraged by injustice. What to us might seem something, well, it's unfortunate, but to the prophets, it's intolerable. And perhaps we need a bit of that sense of prophetic rage at the injustice in our society. The prophetic message for me is, though, also a message of hope. It's a message that says that there is peace coming. The prophets, I think, were the first in history to imagine the idea of world peace. That's extraordinary. What does that mean? No more war. And I just want to point out to you, because I just did a study of the history of biblical scholarship in Germany on the prophets. The German Bible scholars had no interest in the prophets. They said they're a bunch of ecstatics rolling on the ground, losing consciousness, etc. And I think, look what they did to themselves, those scholars. They took away the possibility of the prophets playing a central role in Germany, in the society, in the politics of that country. And that's so terribly unfortunate. And what do we have in our country? We have the prophets, and that's from Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. The prophets telling us, by the way, that the climax of history is peace. Evil is never the climax of history. The climax of history is justice and peace, and that's an extraordinary lesson, and it's something that we have to keep in our hearts, keep up our hope, keep hope alive, as we used to say.
Exactly, still do.
We still do.
Yeah. I think we have some questions from the audience. Jody, thank you. And we will get to as many of these as we can. So this, I don't know that this is necessarily a question for the two of you, but someone wants to know why you call this event Praying with Their Feet. And I think it was legs, actually, isn't the actual,
So my father was invited by Dr. King to come to Selma for the march in 1965, and he was there, of course, and when he came back, he said that he felt holiness in that march. He said it reminded him of walking with Hasidic Rebbes in Europe. He said, I felt my legs were praying. So that's where this phrase comes from.
I think it's a wonderful thought. It also echoes the Buddhist idea of the walking meditation of being connected.
Yes.
But through movement, through actually taking things forward. I think it's a lovely way. This person says this is a charged question. And she says, while intersectionality is an important social and political concept, has it played a negative role in decreasing Jewish involvement? And I think, Susanna, that might be a question for you.
Well, if it has, it shouldn't, because there's a lot of misunderstandings. So Kimberly Crenshaw is a professor of law. Explain to us, some people say, is the suffering that I had, the discrimination and the persecution, because I'm a woman, or because I'm black, or because I'm Jewish, because of my age, because of my sexual identity? And she said, instead of fighting one against the other, who's worse, who's got it better, who's and so on, let's understand that we're made up of many complex identities. Many complex identities. And there are times when I know somebody is patronizing me because I'm a woman. And there are times when I know that somebody is sneering at me because I'm Jewish. And there, et cetera, et cetera. Her concept means that there are many ways that we are identified and that we claim identities. And that's what she calls intersectionality. Let's think of it in multiple ways. I think there's been misunderstanding around the term. It doesn't have for me, it doesn't have a problematic implication at all. I think it's a useful term, and I think it settled a lot of arguments, actually, and made us think in deeper ways. So, yeah.
I think it was what you were saying too, Bernice, with the idea of this interconnectedness, that we are probably all more alike than different.
Yeah, and I always like to use my father's quote there because I think it aptly describes who we are. He said, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. And what affects one directly affects all indirectly, and I can't be all that I ought to be until you're all that you ought to be, and you can't be all that you ought to be until I am all that I ought to be." There really is this whole interrelatedness and interconnectedness in life. And when we can identify with that, and even for me, when we can recognize with all of these different human experience and human identities that ultimately we are spirit beings having a human experience. If we could just begin to accept that, I think it can help us to deal with a lot of these issues that we have, because now we have to look at how do we correct ourselves so that everyone, regardless of that human identity, that human experience, has equity in this life.
This kind of goes back to what you were saying, as sort of our advice to the young folks in the audience. These two folks wanted to know, how can the young people get adults to take them seriously, particularly when they're working hard to change things?
Keep doing what you're doing. And I really mean that. You know, sometimes when you are working in the area of justice, there's going to be criticism, misunderstanding. You're going to be maligned. I mean, all kind of stuff comes your way. But if you spend more time focused on that than what you are intending to affect, you won't be effective. So, you know, what is that statement that Gandhi made? He had to go catch up with his people. Mm-hmm. So if you keep doing it, the adults are going to have to pay attention eventually. Mm-hmm. So do what you're doing. Eventually, they're going to take you seriously. And a good example is in the 60s when they started the sit-ins, a lot of people don't realize that was occurring in a lot of different places in small ways. It wasn't as large as eventually it became. And so my father and them took note of what these young people were doing and recognized that we need to come alongside and undergird them and bring a little structure to it. That's how SNCC was founded, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so they were out there doing it. And they were not going to stop. And some adults took note and said, okay, we got to come alongside of them.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe the way to think about it is that you don't expect someone to take you seriously unless you take yourself seriously and do the work. Yeah. And the follow-on question for that was, do you feel that our young people have been educated enough to become the leaders they need to be?
Well, first of all, if you are a leader worth your salt, you're always a student. There's never a point where you arrive and you know everything. So I think that there's a lot they can learn and have to continue to learn. I think I keep challenging, and I'll do that continuously, people to study what was effective. I mean, the 50s and 60s, they were effective. And there's something to learn from that. And, I know people, we've had, groups of young people say, this is not my grandmama's movement. No, it's not your grandmother's movement, but it is a continuation of your grandmother's movement. You wouldn't have no movement. if it wasn't for your grandmamas.
Right.
You know, your grandmamas gave something. I think about, this just the First Amendment right. As Daddy said, the right to protest for right. That was really strengthened in the 50s and 60s. These young people don't recognize it's different. Back then, it was very dangerous to protest back then. It's not as dangerous today. And so it is a continuation, and therefore, don't be afraid to learn and extract from the past to help you in your present to move you towards your future. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't take away from you. You can add whatever innovation and creativity and style and flavor you want to it. But if you don't learn from that history, you'll be repeating yourself. And the other thing is, many of these people who are involved in activism now, some of them are getting weary because they don't recognize that there is a method to all of this. And there are people who can teach them that method so that they can, sustain themselves and persevere. You got to use wisdom in this work.
Yeah, because it's hard work,
It is.
as we've been saying. Yeah. Do you have anything that you wanted to add?
It is hard to persevere, but I guess I would also just emphasize that the future does belong to the young people, and we also look to them for their inspiration, and our hearts are with them. Yeah, they do. I look back at John Lewis. He was so young, and then just a couple of weeks after being beaten in the head, he marched again on the Pettus Bridge. He didn't walk away. He didn't go home. There he was, and he was so young. It's extraordinary, that bravery.
This person would like to know, what, if anything, did your respective fathers say about what it was like to march with the other one? So did your father, Susanna, say anything about what it was like to march with Dr. King, and did your father say anything to you about marching?
Well, I was too young.
Too young.
So
He didn't say anything to you.
No, I don't remember much of anything. I don't even remember my mother saying anything. So.
Well, this is the picture of the march in Selma, and someone from Hawaii brought leis for some of the marchers. And my father, as you see, he's the second from the right with the beard and the white hair, and he told me that a little boy came over to him and said, "Are you Santa Claus?" But I also know, I remember when Dr. King spoke out against the war in Vietnam in Riverside Church in April of 1967, and I was there that evening. But in the year prior, there was a lot of discussion in my home about whether Dr. King should speak out against the war. What would it do to the civil rights movement? It would alienate Congress and the president, and most civil rights leaders were opposed to speaking out against the war.